digitaljamsessions.com. Hello and welcome to this Digital Jam session. Today we are joined once again by Rob Yescombe, and Marta returns to us as well. Welcome back, the both of you.
Hi.
Oh,
Good
hi.
to be back.
So, for the benefit of our lovely listeners, I'm going to ask you to remind them exactly what it is you do. Now, I'm going to start with you, Rob, because I know that you have a small, tiny little game that you might want to talk about. But before you get to that game, let's go through some of the other things that you've been doing in the course of your career. Tell them all about your work in the games industry, Rob.
Crikey, that means I'm forced to remember it. Okay, so I've been working as a writer and narrative director for 12 years, almost 13.
Mm-hmm.
And in that time, I've worked across big IP, small IP, new IP, old IP, from quadruple A right down to the tiniest little indie teams and everything in between. But my primary focus over the last 4 years or so has been purely on VR and trying to figure out how best to tell a story in VR in a way that is worthy of a new medium. And to your point about the game I'm keen to talk about is called The Invisible Hours, which is a murder mystery in VR that I will bore you with the details of momentarily. After Marta's had her say.
We'll get into that. But it's also worth mentioning, of course, Rob, that you are an alum of the VR Writers' Room as well.
Yes.
So, Marta, why don't you explain this very complex explanation of exactly what you do? Because you are like one of these true superhero types. You have a job by day, but you also have a moonlighting job by night. Why don't you explain to our lovely listeners exactly what you do?
That is an epic introduction. Just one woman, 5 jobs. No, I'm kidding. So I work as a marketing manager by day in tech. It's very exciting. And by night, I work as a mocap performer, an action performer, which is where the superhero stuff comes in, but also a voiceover artist and generally an actor that will jump on any which interesting project that people throw my way. So I've done quite a few different things now.
Wonderful.
Mainly with swords.
Lots of swords. You do have a thing about swords, it has to be said.
Definitely.
But welcome and thank you for joining us. And in the context of the conversation, I found it quite interesting that, Marta, you are working within mocap. So you're literally putting on the very flattering suits with the lovely little bubbles on them.
But so flattering.
So very
Beautiful.
flattering. But Rob, you're on kind of the other side of this fence as a writer and a narrative designer. You're working with these performers. And there are a lot of complexities involved when capturing performance. Not just in general, but also in the context of VR. And I know that one of the things that you've done with The Invisible Hours is creating spherical narrative. So why don't we talk for just one moment in time about spherical narrative so that we can catch up our listeners as to where we're at, and then we can take it further down the line.
Well, as a quick sidebar to that, so people who I talk to in linear media, one of the things that they can sometimes struggle with is that in broad strokes, for the last 120 years, a movie has been the same, which is it's 2 hours and somebody learns something about themselves and that's the end. But having worked in games and unconventional narrative for as long as I have, I still can't tell you what the game is after having worked in this business for so long, because on a narrative level, that's an equation that you are resolving with almost every project. So the puzzle that we were trying to solve with The Invisible Hours was to say, well, is there a way to transplant the structure through which story occurs in real life and transplant it into VR? And the way that story works in real life is that since the beginning of time, anytime one human being wanted to tell another human being a story, let's say I want to tell you what I was doing before I came on this podcast, I have to deconstruct reality and reconstruct it as words in this conversation, or as ink on a page, or as shots in a film or a level in the game. But fundamentally, I have to make reality not reality in order to make it something that you can understand and appreciate. The other complexity is that in this unit of time, as the three of us are having this conversation, I am the protagonist of my story. And I'm sorry to say that both of you are just supporting characters, but in the exact same unit of time, each of you are protagonists in your own stories, and the rest of us are just background characters. And the people walking behind me outside my window are background actors or supporting characters in the background, but at the same time I'm a supporting character and the background character to all of them, and all of those narratives are all completely interdependent. And even the most distant person in the background behind me, my story cannot exist in its form as it is now without them having their entire life synchronized to a point where they and I are in the same place at the same time. So what the invisible hours is it takes a single unit of time, and we use a sort of classic murder mystery model. So it's a mansion on an island in the middle of a storm. And within that hour, you have 7 suspects roaming around this mansion. And if you are a person who goes in to observe this story, let's say you follow someone who seems suspicious up to the attic. Well, in that exact same unit of time, the rest of the characters are in other rooms in the house, and you're missing all of that by virtue of the choice you made to be upstairs. So it's not like you would normally see in a game where things branch. This is about simultaneous multiple threads of narrative that are all independent on each other and all interweave into a single narrative. So what that means is that with the exact same content, you and I could have completely different experiences, and even viewing the same moments in the same content, just by virtue of where we're standing in the room, might have different interpretations of what that content means, just like real life. So when I was saying earlier, it was an incredibly, if not the most complex motion capture shoot in history, because when you have 7 characters interwoven within a single hour of narrative, you've got 7 hours of narrative all interwoven into 1 hour. And let's say you and I, Marta, are characters in this scene, and I know that we are due in a room that is 12 and a half meters away, and we're due in that room in 19 seconds. I know that we have to wrap up this scene at the exact precise moment that gives us the exact amount of time to walk at the exact speed, that exact distance, to interrupt that next scene at the exact time that we need to interrupt it. And then you're multiplying that across hundreds of scenes. When you're shooting that on a stage, that is an incredibly complicated thing to do, because all of those hundreds upon hundreds of jigsaw pieces have to fit together perfectly. Even with a little bit of motion editing here and there, you have to be accurate within the second on everything you do. Even on, Marta, I'm sure you're familiar with, if you're doing traversal stuff in mocap, you have to hit your marks exactly.
Yeah.
But here we're talking about not just hitting your physical marks, you're talking about hitting some of the toughest emotional marks you might need to hit in the scene, but you need to deliver that in 23 and a half seconds or 3 minutes and 2 seconds or whatever. And it needs to be real. And yet we need to have it drilled with such precision that jigsaw puzzle piece is not going to break anything else across the production. Because if you get 1 second wrong, it throws everything else out.
It's interesting though, Rob, when you talk about this structure and you talk about this precision that's needed, it kind of reminds me a little bit of listening to the team at Les Enfants Terribles talking about the complexity and the precision required for immersive theatre.
It's a similar format, but the difference with immersive theatre is that if you and I are 10 seconds late for a scene that we're due in, the actors in that other scene can fill. There's a flexibility in what they're doing. But when you're doing something that is basically a pre-baked, like a massive 7-hour pre-baked cutscene, at least on the production level, there's absolutely no margin for error whatsoever.
So a quick question, actually. Were you able to edit the footage at all to help the performance? Edit the data, speed it up, or slow it down a little bit to fit that exact time frame, or had zero margin whatsoever?
We planned it for zero margin, but there were naturally moments. The possibility, the mathematical probability of error is so high because you've got all these moving pieces. We did end up doing a little bit of motion editing, but by and large that was on traversal stuff, because our safety plan was knowing, okay, if we set rooms X distance apart, it means that we can speed up traversal anims X amount without them looking weird, and you can start to have a little bit more control there, where you might get 4 seconds either side if you're in a real bind. But most of it was accurate enough to just fit the pieces together.
So just because I'm really aware that some of our listeners may not be familiar with some of these terms, would you care to explain what traversals are? Just very briefly.
When a character walks in the game, that is a traversal animation, and usually the way that works is that it's built on a loop. So you might walk across, say, 5 yards or 10 yards, and then that animation would be synced to loop back on itself.
And Marta, why don't you tell us a little bit about the physicality of performing one of these? Because if I recall rightly, you explained this very well about how one needs to start and finish in the same position.
Yeah, there's a lot of little things that I think non-mocap performers are surprised to find out when they first venture into it. So one thing is these traversals, and I believe that, and I was confused this, but I believe it's the looping animation happens basically when your right leg passes your left leg. They kind of loop it with the favorite two steps and so on and so forth. But that means you always start and finish in the same position when you're walking. But that same thing applies to starting and finishing a movement. So for example, an animation that is, I don't know, an arm swing. Maybe I'm a creature and I'm going to swing my arm at something. I have to start it in one position, as in I'm about to move my arm, and then do that motion, and then finish in the exact same position that I started in, possibly on an exact marker on the floor. Now, the reason why this happens, and the reason why this is absolutely essential to motion capture, is what Rob mentioned. These are animations. So you usually do not do continuous scenes. You will not do one scene start to finish, because this eliminates the element of choice for a player. The player needs to be able to choose whatever sequence of movements they want to do at any which point in time. So instead of predetermining every movement, you have to give this kind of palette of movements, but they need to blend seamlessly. So the way you blend animations is by having this common pose called an idle in between them. So you're able to start from the same position, arm swing, and finish in the same position. That way, if you start your next move, which might be a kick, in the same position and finish in the same position, you give the animator this option of blending movements seamlessly. So when you then have, for example, a fight, you have to fight a big monster in a game, you're able to have your fight animations blend seamlessly one from another, so the movement looks very natural. But you choose exactly how many punches with the right hand and how many punches with the left hand and how many kicks and all these different things you want to do at any which point in time. And that applies to all of these animations. The only time that you don't have to worry about an idle really to that extent is if you're filming a cinematic, which is like a cut scene in a game, which is more like a start to finish, little movie clip style. But everything else, you have to be extremely aware of how you position your body.
Okay. So one of the things that I think is quite interesting in the process with the invisible hours, and I'm kind of curious to hear from both of you actually, kind of whether or not you think that there is some scope here to rethink the way that physical production happens when it comes to capturing performance for VR. And I say this, Rob, on the basis of you started, your opening statement was that it was the most complicated mocap shoot in history, which suggests that there were a lot of issues and a lot of challenges that you needed to overcome. And so I wonder whether or not there is some basic scope here in terms of simple wins, really easy things that can be done to help to streamline this process and make it easier for people who follow in your footsteps.
Well, I think it's, again, no two productions are the same. Some solutions may be common between productions, but Invisible Hours was so far unique. But the thing that allowed us to do that was something that you never really get in mocap most of the time, which is rehearsal time. We spent a month drilling those scenes to get them to the second so that we could do everything by the stopwatch. I mean, we're talking about several hundred scenes and sequences that had to be able to fit together. So there's no way you can do that on the mocap stage. It's just, I mean, bear in mind, we were not a big budget production, so it meant that it's not uncommon for larger studios to go to a mocap stage basically unprepared, to have maybe a shot list and then kind of give it a go on the day. But having worked in quadruple A and triple A and in indie, I'm very, very conscious of that money and where else it could be spent when you're on a smaller production. So we were extremely conscientious, and I should give a shout out to Damon Tasker, who was the mocap shoot co-director with me and prepared the shoot backs and made sure that everything was on target. It's not just a matter of a director showing up and saying, let's do this. I mean, there were a lot of people that needed to be on point in order to make that shoot function.
It's interesting that you say this because Marta recently participated in a project which we will not name. We're not able to talk about it in any great depth, but one of the things that I think is in common here is it was a 360 shoot. It was a VR shoot, but that you did have rehearsal time. Now, all in, you'll have to confirm exactly how much rehearsal time you had, but you had at least one day of rehearsal time ahead of the actual shoot itself, the day before the shoot. But you also had lead up time to that pre-rehearsal day. How much time did you have all in to do the rehearsals?
So what we did was rehearsals, and there was conceptualization of the different sort of choreographies, if you will, call them that. So I would say all together about 3 days of work, if I'm looking at like standard days, just to prep for these things. And, these were nowhere near the level of complexity that, Rob was explaining for the game. And I wanted to really say that, Rob, I wish most people that do motion capture would share your approach to this, because as a performer, most of the time what's expected of me is to rock up on the day, be given some fairly vague instructions, and just nail it right away, because every take that's not usable is money down the drain.
It's interesting. I was watching an interview with Alec Baldwin a couple of days ago, and he was saying sometimes as an actor, you're a plumber. You show up to fix the leak or to put the pipes in, and even though every instinct in your body might be, these pipes are beneath me, sometimes you just gotta churn it out. But I think ultimately the games industry is a very strange place emotionally, because it grew out of 1 and 2 person studios that were people in their parents' basements, literally, and that meant there was a very sort of self-shooting attitude. And even though we've gone up to multi-million dollar productions, there's still a little bit of that everybody kind of feels like they can do everybody else's job better.
This is so true.
It's very true.
And the thing is that there's a lot of good that can come from that, because in film it's good to have the pyramid where the director is at the top and then everything kind of runs from there. In TV it's good to have the writer at the top, everything runs from there. But games is generally a flatter structure. You have directors of departments. But the truth is that has its downside, which I think happens on the performance side often. But it has its upside, because that level and depth collaboration is the only way certain games can happen.
And that was actually the word I was going to use there, was collaboration. I do think that it allows for more collaboration. And I wonder if, on the basis of a lot of what we see emerging into the VR industry at the moment in terms of content tends to be games industry led, do you think that that's possibly part of the reason why there is such a spirit of collaboration within the VR industry at the moment?
Well, there's certainly a spirit of collaboration in TV and film as well. But what the big thing for me is that I think, having had experience with linear media companies who are trying to transition into VR, even though all of the creative sensibilities may be very similar, the pipeline differences to creating something that's true VR is night and day to a film. And I think that's the thing that I want to keep pushing. I don't want to force anybody's hand in the kind of content that they create. But as VR becomes more and more, and I don't use this as a sort of commonly, the way that immersion is commonly used, you just sort of throw it out. But I'm talking about literal immersion, which means navigation and interaction. That can only exist within the game's pipeline. And so to those companies that are thinking, well, we want to move into VR, for God's sake, get a games producer on board and build your studio in that direction, because you cannot sustain the pipeline with linear media stuff. It's
interesting that you say this, because there are a lot of people who are coming at this from more linear storytelling backgrounds who don't necessarily understand the complexity of I'm not even going to say immersive storytelling at this stage. I'm just going to say interactive storytelling in terms of the complexities of game design or game narrative versus a linear storytelling model. And that there are a lot of people who may come in as a filmmaker, for example, who wants to make a 360 film, and then once they've kind of already locked themselves into process or kind of backed themselves into a corner in terms of the production and the shoot list, etc., then they kind of go, and by the way, we want to add some interactivity, we want to have a little bit of this whole kind of interactivity thing, and you're kind of looking at them going, well, it's a little bit late now. You could have thought of that a little bit sooner.
Well, equally, I don't want to prescribe to people kinds of content that they should make. If people want to make 360 stuff, if they want to make linear stuff that's inside VR, by all means. I mean, the truth is that, for instance, I, as a writer, am not often very excited at the prospect of writing an RPG, because what excites me in games personally is feeling the hand of the author, and feeling that someone is trying to communicate something in the way that a piece of art is communicated by the author. And in that way, I don't have a problem with linear content in VR or whatever way they want to make it, as long as it is serving a well-informed vision. That's all that interests me. As long as people are not limited by what they think the medium is,
absolutely,
rather what it can be. That's all.
No, and the thing is, though, what I'm getting at is that this idea that because somebody comes from a different background, they're not planning, or they're not aware that they need to plan in a particular way, which is what I'm saying about trying to bolt on interactivity after the fact rather than during the process. And I am kind of curious from your perspective, Marta, because you have seen a bit of a cross-section in terms of TV and film and also immersive theatre as well as gaming, whether or not you are seeing any of those types of kind of impacts from people who are kind of asking for things that perhaps they just weren't aware that they could have asked for a lot earlier, or that they should have been thinking about a lot sooner when it comes to doing VR or doing 360 film. Because I know that you've been asked to do a couple of different things now, and the people in your networks and your circles have been asked to do quite a few different 360 shoots and VR pieces now. Do you find that there is a little bit more of that kind of randomness, if you like, in the same way that when you turn up for mocap, it's kind of a, hey, just do this and hit it. Do you feel like that perhaps with some of the VR performances that you're being asked to do, that there's a degree of that in terms of maybe a lack of understanding of what they're asking for?
I think yes and no. It's an odd one, really, because I would bring it back to the whole point of collaboration. It really depends on who you're working with and what kind of experiences they had. So who is sort of the leading mind behind a certain project and what their background is. It has a very heavy influence on how everything else is handled and what questions are asked. Now, I've worked with people who, come from a pure sort of animation games background, and they didn't know to ask a lot of the performing sides, which was a situation where having a lot of rehearsal time, or even some rehearsal time, would have really helped, because I can bring a lot to the table as a performer in terms of interpretation, in terms of what makes sense and what doesn't once you're actually doing the character. Other times, I dare say some people over prepare, some people from a more like film-based background or theater, traditional theater-based background, where you have a lot of rehearsal time and you just have to nail it so that by the time it comes to the shoot, you have everything really rigidly in place. And then they don't quite know how to deal with changes, on the fly. So as a performer, I wouldn't speak for, other roles, but like as a performer, I think what you need to be is try to help, not ever be condescending or talking back or whatever, anything like that, because you're there to perform. But try to ask those questions if you think nobody has asked them. In a very respectful way, and sort of highlight that maybe that information might be useful, but also really just be flexible on the day to see what happens, and try to use some of your ability to improvise and to change and to adjust. It's really, it's a strange one, but it really depends on what kind of team you're working with. And personally, I have to say, funnily enough, when I started doing mocap, my most useful skills came from immersive theater. So yeah, it's a weird one, but it's because there's no standards set. There's no agreements like you have in film or TV or theater. It's still very much like the unions and equity are trying to figure out how to even deal with this. What is supposed to be the best practice, because people are just kind of exploring, trying to figure it out, seeing what works, what doesn't, and moving on. But what I would say, collaboration is absolutely key. That, the game studios don't try to do absolutely everything themselves. That they do go out and seek advice or new knowledge about storytelling, about performance, about what they could do to develop this further from other genres that have done it really well. Get that information.
Okay. So one of the things that I am kind of interested to find out from both of you is what you would say to those people who are listening who are thinking about stepping into the VR arena, of which there are many people thinking about doing this. What's the best bit of advice that you could give them, given that every project, as you say, Rob, is completely different? And as you rightly say, Marta, every performance is different and every group around you is different and there are different dynamics involved. What would be the consistent advice that you could give to somebody who's thinking about getting involved, be that from a directorial perspective, a writing perspective, or a performance perspective? What would be the thing that you would say to them in terms of whether that's breaking the myth of something they might believe is the case, or just giving them a little bit of insight into something that they may not realize is potentially going to be an issue for them? So I will start with you, Rob.
That's a long list. I think that there's two ways you can answer that. I think you can answer that sort of artistically, or you can answer it practically.
Go with practical. I think our lovely listeners would like practical.
I'll come back to the artistic bit in a minute, but but practically speaking, I mean, simple things like knowing what your expectations are and what returns you can get in the market as it is. Mm. It is growing, but just make sure that you have proper insight into what you can get so that you don't spend beyond your means. Mm. And as far as practical production concerns, kind of what I said before, I think that if you have a vision that feels like something that belongs in VR, chances are you probably need some kind of games-like pipeline. Mm. Don't try and hack a film pipeline into VR, because you'll end up shooting yourself in the foot one way or another. Either you limit yourself needlessly because you haven't expanded to explore other possibilities. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there's definitely a danger of that, and lots of content does still fall foul of that. But having said that, it's perfectly understandable that it does, because it's still a new medium, and the Venn diagrams between film and games don't cross over as much as perhaps they should in terms of understanding. Mm-hmm. As far as artistically goes, I mean, it's the same as anything else. If it doesn't have a reason to exist, don't make it. That sounds sort of like an easy thing to say, but there is not a lot of value in making something unless there is an artistic imperative to make it.
No, I'm sitting here nodding. And agreeing with you entirely, because there are a lot of people who are needlessly making content and they haven't really thought it through in terms of, does it really need to be in VR? Does it serve the story? Does it serve the art to necessarily deliver it in a VR or immersive format?
And by the way, that's not to preclude, the classic AAA game. That stuff is just as much place as anything else. But I say the same thing, not just about VR, but anything that anyone is making. Even if you're making the most conventional first-person shooter in the world, if there is no reason to make it artistically, something is going to be missing, and ultimately that will hurt your sales, believe it or not. Mm-hmm. Because ultimately, yes, some people want to buy Res, where it is pure design. Some people want to buy Tetris, that's pure design. But most of the time, what you are selling when you're selling a game is, before design, you're selling context. And context is narrative. Mm-hmm. And narrative needs to come from a place of human truth, whether you like it or not, one form or another. So you got to dig in before you build out into your big franchise. That's the truth of it.
Okay. And Marta, what about you? What would you say to our lovely listeners who are thinking about getting into VR?
I think from a performance perspective, plan rehearsal time. Number one. You will really start to understand, especially when it comes to sort of understanding the space around whoever is going to be viewing this, and how to best place people around it. But also, even though in motion capture, this data can be edited and you can place things wherever you want them. If you understand as a performer, if your performer understands where things are going to be coming at them, how they're going to be interacting with you, things like that, it makes the performance more real. Mm-hmm. You have a more detailed brief, a more detailed environment to work from. And that really translates into good performance. A great performer can do great things, but if you don't give them enough information, if that thought process hasn't been done in terms of where you belong in this, it can cause real problems. Even the best performer will not give you what you want. Mm. Also, really think in terms of casting, like, does this person fit? Yes, again, motion capture allows for a lot of editing, but you want to do the minimal amount of editing because editing is expensive. Mm-hmm. So just approaching it with a little bit of a traditional view. And also, I would say seek advice from people who work in the performing arts, whether it's directors, whether it's other actors or producers, anybody that can help you with this process if mocap is the way you want to go. Because performance is performance, and they will give you very valuable advice on how to work with actors, how to ask the right questions, how to really just get what you want instead of guessing and thinking, I kind of got what you want, and then getting on the volume on the day and just not being very happy. So just because somebody hasn't necessarily worked in VR doesn't mean that they can't give you some valuable advice in terms of working with performers.
Okay, wonderful. Well, as always, we like to give our listeners a way to find out a little bit more about you, and we ask you to do that by sharing with us your social media handle of choice. What would that be, Rob?
Leave me alone.
No, it is. I'm on Twitter at Rob Yescombe.
Thank you. And Marta?
And I am also on Twitter at Martholio.
Thank you very much. So, as always, thank you for joining us and thank you for listening. If you enjoy this content, don't forget to subscribe and review, and follow us on Twitter at Digital Jam Ltd. Thinking of starting your own podcast? Why not speak to the GL Pro UK team? They handle all of our podcasting service needs. Tell them that Digital Jam Session sent you and you'll get 10% off your first order. Find out more at www.glpro.co.uk. DigitalJamSessions.com